by recognizing that we are on the unceded ancestral territory of the Musqueam Nation. And as David Boyd mentioned recently, we are still not paying rent from UBC too. But I'd also like to introduce Alex Moore, who came to UBC in July of 2021 as part of the iBios cluster that Claire and others have been slowly but surely building. But your first talk to this group, although many of us came to your job talk, Alex comes from Yale School of Forestry, fairly conventional predator-prey thesis work in wetland context, and then has expanded there to interests that we all share extensively, which is thinking as well about the human dimensions of conservation, culture in reference to conservation, and many other pieces. So welcome, Alex.
Okay, can folks on Zoom hear me with my mic where it is? Let's just double check. I'm gonna assume the silence is mostly yes. It is, okay, great. Well, thank you, Terry, for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation to speak here today. I want to start by just apologizing for those of you who did come to my job talk. This will be basically that, just truncated into 30 minutes. So you can doze off if you feel so inclined. So with that, so I am here to kind of just give a very kind of basic overview of some of the work that I've done and some of the work that I hope to do moving forward. And it focuses a bit on the restoration side of conservation and thinking about the ways that we can try to do a better job of incorporating both science and also social and cultural aspects into that practice. And so with that in mind, oh, I'm timing myself. Okay. I like to begin with just providing a basic definition so that we're all kind of on the same page about what we're talking about. So the Society for Ecological Restoration defines restoration as the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. And that can happen in any number of ways, but here's just a really quick example of what this might look like from a visual perspective. So this is a time series of what it would look like from an ecosystem to go from some prior degraded or negatively impacted state over a time period of restoration efforts to then have it become at least visually looking like a healthy, functioning system. And so the idea here for restoration is that it's quite a complicated process, and the end goals are really tricky to define in some cases. I just want to do like one really quick interactive part with just like a hands-up situation where I'm curious how many of you think that most restoration efforts would be considered a success. So we're doing a good job of meeting the goals of our restoration practice whenever we like go out and do that. How many of you think that like more likely than not that we're doing a pretty decent job of recovering services in most spaces? No one. There's like two or three hands. Okay, great. Yeah, it's complicated. It's actually quite a bit of a mixed bag. Depending on the type of system you're focusing on, restoration outcomes are more successful than others. Those metrics are also quite different. How you're defining success will vary from project to project. But there are a ton of different papers that have come out over the last several years that have noted that there are restoration efforts that do happen across a variety of ecosystem types, and that our success in doing that is not ideal, right? We're not in most cases doing as well as we would like to. And there are some potential explanations for why that might be. And I'm happy to kind of get into what I think the reasons for that are, specifically for wetland systems, because that's the kind of space that I tend to focus on. And so as a place to start, what I'm showing you here is a map of the global distribution of wetlands, where the green is the wetlands themselves, the blue represents the different bodies of water. And as you can see, just from looking at the map, wetlands are found across the globe, and they are quite tricky to, one, define the boundaries of, and also define what a wetland is itself. So from a very generic standpoint, a wetland is land that is wet, and that is not super informative. There are more technical definitions for it. But with that in mind, even with that really basic broad definition, a lot of different kinds of systems fall within that particular category. And so that could mean anything ranging from a number of the photos that you see up here. So salt marshes and bogs and swamps and fens and a variety of different other kinds of spaces are all considered wetlands, even though they all function differently. They have different species composition, and they're found in different kinds of zones throughout the globe. And so to help kind of narrow that focus down, the work that I do focuses on coastal systems. And so these can be placed into kind of three broad categories, which are salt marshes, mangrove forests, and then seagrass beds. And so these are found in both tropical and subtropical regions across the globe. They make up a pretty small sort of portion of the global land surface area. But despite their small size, they do a ton of really important things, both for nature and for people, including serving as really important biodiversity hotspots. They help mitigate climate change impacts. They provide food and water resources for local communities. And they also tend to have really important recreation and tourism economies associated with them. So they do a ton of stuff, even though they don't take up all that much space. Now, we know that they're important. We know that there are very few of them. It turns out that just because we know something's important doesn't mean we do a great job of taking care of it. And so it turns out that coastal wetlands in particular are among the most threatened ecosystems globally. So they have been experiencing significant losses for the past several decades. And part of the reason for that is due to human impacts. I'm listing or sort of identifying 4 kind of primary human impacts that are leading to the loss of coastal systems globally. And so these include things like climate change and the associated sea level rise. We've got resource extraction. So this is primarily related to mangrove forests. So their timber tends to be super important for use locally. We also have land conversion. So taking coastal systems and turning them either into agriculture or aquaculture, which is what's shown here. And that's a primary cause of loss in Southeast Asia. And then this last photo here on the right is a blue crab. And so this is meant to kind of signal the loss of particular species from these ecosystems can lead to these kind of cascading effects that negatively impacts the function of the entire system overall. And I know that sounds really dramatic. And so I did want to provide an example of how that might play out. And I'm saying this, and I'm not giving you an example. So I'll actually give you an example later. But the kind of big picture goal for restoration is to take a site that looks like this. So this is an unhealthy, degraded, denuded salt marsh system, and then turn it into something that looks a little bit more like this. And just for anyone who might ask this, these are not the same place. I just thought they looked good next to each other for this example. But the general takeaway here is that when we do restoration practice, we're not super great at doing it, particularly for wetland systems. We know that restored wetlands tend to function by roughly 33% less well compared to kind of a natural counterpart. So biodiversity ecosystem processes are pretty significantly reduced in restored wetlands compared to their natural counterparts. And so part of my work is in trying to figure out what are some of the reasons that we have that gap between the restored spaces and what we're defining as these natural healthy spaces. And there are a number of different potential variables. So like, what's the local context? What's the reason that the environment was degraded in the first place? What's the local climate? Other different things may impact outcomes. But one thing that we don't interrogate all that often, which is something I'm spending a lot of my time interrogating, is just maybe by the steps we take in the restoration practice, those are maybe not sufficient to get the kind of recovery that we're looking for. So not necessarily other external issues, but also just like the practice and the process might be leading to a reduction in the kind of health we'd like to see. And so while many efforts are, they're super different. So there's not a one size fits all approach for how to do restoration, but most of them tend to at least include these 3 stages, which are to remove the disturbance. So whatever's causing that initial problem, deal with that before moving on to anything else. Improve your soil quality and also address the hydrology of the system. So this is really just making sure you have this foundational base where vegetation and other species can actually subsist and grow and be productive. And then also then restoring the vegetation. And the sort of general assumption here is that these are the steps that are necessary to build kind of the foundational habitat for these healthy systems, such that other species will come back into those environments and then provide the functions and services that are expected of them. And so this approach, by kind of focusing on these physical and abiotic aspects, are really due to this sort of historical ecological assumption that these physical parts are what matters the most in coastal systems, whereas the biological aspects are like kind of important, but not all that important. So we're not really going to incorporate them into that practice. But there's kind of reason to think that that might not be the case. And I just want to, as a point of clarity, identify kind of the 2 different frameworks that are typically seen when thinking about ecological function within different habitats. And so showing you a really beautiful simplified version of a salt marsh ecosystem where we've got our vegetation, let's say we've got some herbivorous crabs here, and then also a predator up at the top. The primary approach to restoration within these spaces assumes that bottom-up features, so like the physical parts, the abiotic aspects of the system, are what's most important. And so the idea here is that these processes happening in kind of the lower bottom aspects of the system can then propagate up the system to influence these higher order levels of the space to then influence their health and productivity and their function. And so these are bottom up factors. Some examples include things like nutrient availability, hydrology and the tides, different soil characteristics. So these are these kind of physical things that then influence every other part of the system. And it's this kind of perspective that drives most restoration approaches in coastal environments. Which is sort of the opposite or kind of the complement of top-down aspects of the system, where we've got features and processes happening at the top of the system, cascading down to influence features and processes at the bottom part of the system. And so these top-down factors include things like predation and herbivory. Non-consumptive effects can be super important, which is the idea where predators, even though they also consume their prey, make them afraid. So they instill fear in their prey. Prey experiencing fear, they often change their behaviors in certain ways that can also influence their ecosystem. So those are some of those non-consumptive effects that predators can have. And then also thinking about functional role. So what trophic category do you fall within? What's your behavior within that space? These are all kind of top-down features that influence health and function of environments. But it turns out we don't really consider this in sort of the restoration process and practice for coastal systems. Which it seems a little bit silly to me, given that we have a ton of examples from a variety of other systems where individual species play outsized roles on how their habitats function. And so the absence of any of these species would have a really remarkable impact on how that system functions and what's the structure of that system. And so there's reason to believe that this might also be true within coastal landscapes, even though we don't see that application happen all that much in practice. And so what I'm interested in doing in my work is sort of, again, recognizing we have this gap between restored spaces and their sort of natural healthy counterparts, trying to figure out why we have that gap. And I'm interested in taking sort of two approaches to seeing if these two different things might influence outcomes. One is from the perspective of the species. And so what are the different roles of the species that are found within those environments? And then I'll explain the second one later. And how I kind of envision this playing out and how we do actually see happen in certain specific examples is if we, again, have this unhealthy system. So we're going to say that this is likely due to just like massive overgrazing, right? You've got an herbivore within this space eating all the vegetation, both above and below ground, makes it super difficult for anything else to grow back within that environment. And so that, again, beautiful schematic looks like this, where we've got our soil, our super unhappy grass, and then our very happy, robust herbivores here. We can imagine a scenario where it could be super helpful to recover the population size of a particular predator. I listed green crab here. I regret it, and I will explain that to you all later. But we're going to pretend that that just says predator for now. And then the idea here is that if we replace a predator population within that space, we should hopefully see a reduction in the population size of their prey, which can then allow for the vegetation to grow back within those environments. You can think of the scenario where planting might not be the only thing we do because the herbivores will just continue to eat it. But if we're able to help manufacture a system that is more holistic in terms of its ecological dynamics, that might help us get better recovery within those ecosystems. And so then it's happy. And so again, that looks a little bit like this fake sort of after photo of that previous situation. And so there are examples of how this can play out in real life. And I actually, some of the work that I do is kind of meant to test this specifically to see what happens. And so this is from work that published a few years ago, but working along the East Coast of the United States, I conducted a manipulation experiment where I built a bunch of these cages across several salt marsh landscapes. And then among those cages, I then assigned them to different treatments. Does that look bigger than the rest to you? A little bit. So the idea for these experiments is that I had these cages, assign them to these different treatments, where this first one is really just kind of an open control plot. So I'm not doing any manipulation here, just measuring how does this site function all on its own without me doing anything to it. And then I have two manipulation treatments where one cage is set up where we have certain prey species that are able to kind of move freely between and among different cages, but the predator that we're focusing on is fully excluded from that environment. So trying to see like, how does the system function if we take a predator out of that environment? And then we also have the treatment where the predator is now able to be included in that treatment. Prey can still move freely as they see fit, but the predator is now fully confined to that environment. So now trying to get a sense of how these different interactions between predators and their prey might influence certain ecosystem properties. Some of those are listed here. I won't go through all of them, but the general point for these is that I try to measure as many different metrics that are commonly measured as in terms of evaluating performance or different properties within coastal systems. So these are ones that are lifted from the literatures for replicability and comparison across a variety of different kinds of studies. And so here's some tepid evidence that indicates that predators might be doing something relatively important. The variable that we're looking at isn't what's important here, but I just want to note kind of the trends that we're observing. And so the bottom is those three treatments. So the control treatment, the no predator, and then the predator treatment. And we're going to assume that in this case, and in all of the cases, that the initial field site had just like a super happy predator population. So we're not assuming that they were predator depleted. We just are recognizing that this is a useful space for us to work in. And so in this case, we see one level of function under these control conditions. So non-manipulation, we're assuming the predators are present across this space. For the no predator treatment, we're now removing the predator from that environment, and we see a pretty significant shift in that level of function at that particular variable that we're focusing on. And then when we add the predator back into some of these cages, we see a modest recovery of that particular feature within this landscape. And so I know that this is not going all the way back up to the level that we saw initially. There are lots of potential explanations for that, but the trend here is notable and worth sort of keeping in mind as we think about the role that predator-prey dynamics might actually play within recovering certain ecosystem properties within coastal systems. So that was one piece of evidence. I have a second piece. This one's a little messier, but I decided to show it anyways. So looking here at a couple different years for this research, we're only going to focus on 2015, but the reason that I show 2016 is just to recognize that certain trends that we see have lots of variation between years. And so something that's super important for restoration is to actually take measurements over longer time periods so that you can see how is this sort of accumulating over time, because you will get this inter-year variation. But at least for 2015, we saw, again, in conditions where this is the control treatment, we're doing no manipulation, that's that level of above ground biomass for this state, for that treatment. If we take the predator out, we saw this significant increase in that variable. When we put the predator back, we saw it come back down to those previous levels. And so again, the trend is what we're paying attention to. So not necessarily the values themselves, but the recognition that predators interacting with their prey, influencing the properties of the ecosystem, is doing something in a way that has largely been ignored in restoration process. And so this, for me, means it might be important to just kind of go back to the drawing board in terms of how we think about restoration and the steps that we need to include in that process. These first three stages are always important, right? You need the physical habitat, you need to stop impacting it negatively, but it also could be important to intentionally re-add species back into those spaces. So not just assuming that they will come back over time, but realizing that these species being present do positively influence the outcomes of these systems in ways that might allow for better, robust health within these environments. Okay, I feel like that went fast. I'm gonna take a quick drink of water and then do the next part. And so initially I mentioned that I'm kind of trying to interrogate restoration practice from two perspectives. The first is thinking about just increasing our ecological knowledge of these systems and applying better science to the way that we do this work. I think it also is important to incorporate the different social aspects and the cultural aspects that are really relevant for the ways these systems exist across human landscapes. And so I don't think I need to convince this crowd, but I'm gonna just show there are a ton of different papers out that recognize the role that cultural ecosystem services, social values play in how people interact with their environments. And so these are several papers that I have found super foundational in just kind of thinking about the ways in which culture is uniquely and intricately tied to landscape and how people interact with those landscapes, and the ways in which these values and these approaches are often also not incorporated into how we think about restoration. And so the next slide is going to be a table that I kind of want to walk through to, again, convince a crowd I don't think needs to be convinced of the value of this. But so this is from a paper that came out a couple years ago where the authors were trying to collect information on conservation actions and trying to evaluate the outcomes of those actions as measured by the well-being of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and also thinking about conservation outcomes. So whatever conservation goals they had, how were those met based on the different conservation actions? And they were evaluating each of these under the context of who was in control of the project. So was it an externally controlled project, or was it locally controlled by the people who live in those areas and have maintained long ties and histories with these environments? And so I won't go through every aspect of this, but these again are just some of the outcomes. You could either have outcomes that were positive both for local communities and for conservation. It could be negative for both, right? Both negative outcomes for local communities and conservation, and then trade-offs where you have negative for one, positive for the other, or the alternative depending on what you're looking at. And so again, looking at the different actors in this work, so is it externally controlled? Is it locally controlled? And so what they're finding, at least through this work, is that when research efforts or conservation efforts are being locally controlled, outcomes are positive for both local communities and conservation, and more than half of the efforts that were being evaluated. Whereas if they are externally controlled, they're seeing that reduction by a significant amount. So in terms of positive outcomes for both local communities and for conservation is significantly lower if that work is being controlled by external actors. And then for the alternative, when we look at negative outcomes for both well-being and conservation, we saw that in more than 30% of the work that's being controlled by external actors versus those that are being led by local communities. And so there's lots of different ways to kind of digest this information, but I think the big general takeaway here is that local community engagement is super, super important when thinking about the ways that we practice conservation and restoration. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but the slide was here, so I felt like I had to go through it. And so for me, this means, again, kind of going back to this initial board, thinking about the ways we've done things initially, adding in a better ecological knowledge if that is relevant for that system, and then also recognizing the importance of incorporating local values and uses into this work. And I want to say here that this is not meant to be one step. So this is not like step number one, and that's not the last step, right? So these are just all of the things that should be involved. The order in which they happen will vary from system to system and location to location. But they all, I think, do need to be a part of the process regardless. So what this means for me is that I have kind of meandered away from the salt marsh ecosystem work a little bit. I'm still like in it, but I'm shifting gears a tiny bit to think about how to better incorporate some of these cultural values and aspects into the work that I do. And so in that kind of shift, I have moved from salt marshes into mangrove forests and trying to better understand what are the ways that local communities have cultural ties and uses associated with mangroves. In order for me to feel like I'm able to do this work, it felt important to look at what we already know about the culture and how it's related to the ways that people interact with these landscapes. And so I worked on this paper with some students. So this actually was published last year. This slide I didn't update today. But what we did in that work was really went through and looked at all the literature we could find on cultural ecosystem services or cultural values or uses associated with mangrove forests, and then mapped it to see where do we have the most information, again, in the published literature on these particular topics. So this is not to say that like this is all we know in the whole world. It's what we know and what's published in peer-reviewed papers. And so the yellow circles, well, I guess, so you'll see green outlines throughout the tropics. So that's where mangroves are found throughout the globe. And then the yellow circles indicate we found between 1 and 5 papers on cultural services related to mangrove forests in those particular areas. The blue circle means that we found between 5 and 10. And then the red circle means that we found more than 10. So these numbers are super small already, right? But we also see a pretty significant geographic skew in where we know information about these kinds of connections that people have with their landscapes. And so in my effort to try to help fill in some of these gaps, I have been doing work in American Samoa, which is like kind of stuck between these two edges of the map. But an area where we didn't see any papers at all on these topics. And so we know that there are mangroves in these environments. We know that there are people in these environments. So recognizing that there's information there that might be useful for managing those landscapes with community-led efforts is really important to me. And so I have been setting up work in American Samoa over the last couple of years where that's the goal is to really build connection, build relationships, and then try to think about what are some of these really important connections that these communities have with their landscape and how can that be useful for them in terms of how those landscapes are managed. And so I feel like it's important to just provide some context. So we are here-ish. I used to live over there, so I just haven't moved it yet. So we're all up in the sort of left-hand corner. This is Hawaii. That's American Samoa, right? So it is roughly halfway between Hawaii and New Zealand. It's an interesting landscape because it's a US territory, which is complicated for a variety of different reasons. One thing that means is that the people who live here can't vote, they can't be involved in electoral processes that might impact the ways that they live their lives. But one kind of upside to being a territory and not a state is that the US government actually has no say in what they do with their land. So folks who live in American Samoa and are Samoan by blood are the only people who can decide what happens to the land in that space, which is uniquely different than the situation in Hawaii, which has a very similar kind of history. And so those are some of the different dynamics that are at play here. And so I have been in this space meeting with folks and just trying to get a better sense of like, what are the different social and cultural values that the people who live in this area have with these particular landscapes. And so these are just some of the logos of the different organizations that I have worked with. So this is the American Samoa Community College, the National Park of American Samoa. They have their own EPA. And so I've chatted with folks who work in these spaces and also chatted with people who just like live there and don't work in any of these spaces and trying to get a better understanding of what are these different connections that they have with these landscapes. And so this has really just looked like sitting in people's houses and like having their babies crawl all over me and like ask them questions and just sort of chit chat about things that I think might be helpful for me to get a better understanding of the relationships they have with these spaces. And so these are some of the interview questions that I asked, and I wanted to put these up here because I think that it can be helpful to recognize that it's not just about like walking into someone's home and being like, well, what are your cultural values that you have with this landscape? It's really about having different places of like points of understanding. So like I think of a mangrove as being one thing, but they might think of it as being something totally different. So what are some of the ways that we can have shared understanding and shared language about what we're talking about? And then what are some of the other kinds of questions you can ask someone that might elicit different kinds of knowledge related to the ways that they relate to those environments? And so these are some of the questions that I asked in that work. In a previous iteration of this talk, I had like a web of results that showed the different connections between the different interview respondents, but I've decided to skip that for now and just provide a very basic summary of what I know right now. Which is that residents in American Samoa typically use the mangroves like recreationally and also for like subsistence fishing and crabbing. So they're not using it to like get fish and sell to a market. They're using it to feed themselves and their families. And they also have more recently been recognizing the role that mangroves play in protecting coastal communities. American Samoa, because of where it is located, gets a ton of tsunamis like every year, and that has been kind of increasing in sort of intensity over the past couple. And so areas of the island that have still robust, healthy mangrove populations have been largely protected from damage, whereas areas of the island where they've cut down the mangroves have been pretty significantly impacted. So that's becoming a more local awareness about sort of some of the different direct impacts that these environments have. With that in mind, I actually think this last point is interesting, but not surprising. So I think it's also pretty consistent with how people tend to relate to conservation, which is that many of the survey respondents said that they really do want regulations help, like enforce to protect the mangrove, but they also don't want to stop doing what they're doing in sort of their use of that space. And so that area of friction, I think, is not unique to this space. I think it's quite common in terms of what we do within this sort of field of work. And I think that's the space where we have to be able to figure out what are some of the ways that we can have concessions or find areas where we're sort of meeting in the middle around what are some ways that we can act in ways that meet the needs of as many folks involved in this process as possible. And so I don't have any answers to it, but what I can say is that in working with the organizations and in working with the communities in this space, they don't talk to each other. And so part of my work is in sort of bridging the gap between the local communities and those who live on the island who are in charge of managing the landscape to really make sure that a lot of these different voices are included in that process. And so this is my like second to last slide. For me, in thinking about the work that I do and the work that I hope to do moving forward here, both in BC and also in whatever other geographic space I work in, it feels really important to make sure that I'm learning not only about like how nature is working and the ecology of these spaces, but also learning about the people who live in those environments. Because at the end of the day, I will be flying into this area, I will be doing some work, and I will be leaving. And so instead of making this an extractive and sort of parachute model of work, it's important for me to be connecting with the communities to figure out, what do you need? What can I provide? So that when I do leave, they have at least built capacity and additional resources to allow them to maintain that work in my absence. And I do feel like we do have an obligation to do that in all of our work. And so that's like me on my pedestal real quick for a second here. And I think that that would actually just make for more sustainable and equitable conservation and also research in general if we're really thinking about these two things as being married to each other as opposed to being two separate things. And so with that, I'm going to wrap up. I think I have like maybe a minute left, but thank you for your time. And I'm happy to just chat with everybody about whatever you want. Cool. That's it. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, it's been, I mean, a little bit kind of haphazard. So I initially, there's a long story involved to this. Originally, I knew I wanted to work in mangroves. Initially, I was planning to set up work in Southeast Asia while I was doing my postdoc. And so that work was meant to be in, I forget where I was trying to go at the time. I think I was in Malaysia. And they have a rule, which I think is a super great rule, where you have to have like an official connection with a local like institution to do your work in that space. And that permitting process takes a super, super long time, which is longer than I could do in this sort of the lifespan of a postdoc. And so I know it was darker than I meant. And so what I ended up doing was sort of shifting gears geographically. So wanted to work in Hawaii. Hawaii does have mangroves. Where I was working at, and for my postdoc, they had a satellite office in Hawaii, so it would have been pretty easy to do work in that space. Mangroves are non-native in Hawaii, so no one's wanting to do research on like the conservation and restoration of mangroves in Hawaii. So then I was like, where else can I do this work? So I knew someone who knew someone in American Samoa, and they were like, people out in this area have always been wanting to get someone out here to help do work in this area. Is this something you'd be interested in doing? And I was like, yes. And so then what happened was that connection set me up with someone who is from American Samoa who lives there. I met with her on my first visit, and she just drove me around the island. And we went places and we had dinner and we went to people's houses. And it has just been a process of like staying in touch with people, communicating with people, showing my face as much as possible, and building connection. I haven't talked about research with anybody so far, for the most part. That's a lie because I have the surveys, but at least in that first visit, it wasn't about me sitting down and trying to sell a research idea. It was largely just about me like connecting and like talking about myself and then talking to them about their lives and understanding how they exist in those spaces. And for me, it has largely just been about like maintaining connection. The pandemic made it really difficult to get back out there. So I've been out there 2 or 3 times and then haven't been in the last like year or so because of the pandemic. And so in my efforts to make sure that they know that I haven't just like fallen off the face of the earth and decided to do something different, I do like regular email check-ins with them to really think about when's the next time I can come out into that space and connect with more people that they're interested in connecting me with. And so it's kind of a really slow burn in terms of like building relationships with people and then kind of establishing shared goals around what I'm hoping to do with the work, what they're hoping I do with the work, and trying to find spaces where there's lots of significant overlap, and then doing the work in that sort of Venn diagram space. And so yeah, so I've just been like chatting with people in their homes and connecting with them and continuing those relationships through time. I see a second follow-up question. Yeah. Yeah, it's been interesting. So part of the work that I've been able to do, there's kind of 2 aspects to this. The first aspect is really thinking about like my research. And so what's the research that I'm doing? So these interviews, what am I learning from those surveys? How does that serve the folks who work at like the EPA in American Samoa in terms of their efforts to connect with the community better? And so I think part of that, so for me, part of that work is like helping build a bridge that they will hopefully be able to sort of continue building on their own in my absence so that they can have better communication. The second part of that too, so that's like one thing I hope to leave behind, where they're using that information to more equitably make decisions about the land. The other thing that I've been working with is with folks who are faculty or teachers at the American Samoa Community College. I've been involved in their courses to help develop coursework or like activities for students for them to go out into the mangroves or sort of think about ways that they can interview their families about things and sort of tie that into their coursework. And so those are things that are going to be continually used in that space. So finding ways to provide these kinds of opportunities and resources that they can sort of build on as they see fit in my absence. And so that has been kind of the goal so far. Yeah. Yeah. I see you. Yeah. Thank you. Mhm. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I have two answers to that. So I guess the first part, the non-answer part of my statement is that I haven't had to go in and like convince anyone to like stop doing a thing. In my capacity, for the most part, it has been about like, now that this thing has been addressed, what do we do next? And so I haven't necessarily been a part of that first part of like, how do we stop that process from happening? But if I were to, I have two feelings about it. The first is that if I'm entering a space where I am not from and I don't belong, and someone's like, we don't want to stop doing this thing, and they'd be like, okay, you don't have to stop doing that thing because I have no say, right? That is my politic. And I'm not going to go into someone's house and try to convince them how to live it in a way that they see fit or that I see fit for them. If I'm entering a space where there's a sort of a more shared understanding about like people are in a space where they do want to figure out what they want, like how to do things differently in ways that will move the needle forward in a positive way. I think in those cases, it's less about telling people to stop doing what they're doing. And it's either more about trying to think about, can you do that same activity sustainably, or find out what the root of that activity is, and can it be replaced with another activity that meets that same kind of need for them? And so that is something that comes to mind for me because I have some colleague friends who work with like Maasai communities and other different kinds of communities in Africa where like lion hunting, right, has been like a really big rite of passage through different age stages, where some communities have recognized that like that's a little bit messed up in terms of how it's impacting certain species. What are the things that you're learning about yourself? What are the traits that you are gaining from a person doing that activity that you can do in a different activity that doesn't impact wildlife in a super negative way? So I think that we can think about replacement activities that meet the same kind of need, or think about doing that same activity in a more sustainable practice. Like those are the two things that come to mind for me, if that makes sense. Okay. You want to go for it, Carrie? So many hands. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's part of what I, right. And I think that's a super important one. So that I think goes to that like sustainability aspect of things. So part of what this idea for me has been based off of is the recognition that on the East Coast in the US, the loss of like blue crab, striped bass, has led to the increase in these herbivore populations. And so a lot of that has to do with just like poor regulation around like how many things can you like recreationally catch or at least economically catch of like these particular species during vulnerable or important life stages for those species. And so I think in some cases, it's just about having better regulation around like how many of this thing at this time period can we take out to allow for their populations to still be high enough and functional within their environments to allow for the rest of the ecosystem to still function properly. I mean, yeah, right. Yeah, and my vision here for all of this is not to, and because I think part of the way that I've been talking about this, like these are two separate things, and I'm talking about them and thinking about them in these two distinct boxes. My reality is that they're not distinct and that they do sort of share lots of combinations. And so I can imagine scenarios where like this system exists because of the ways that people have impacted them. And so like we just have to recognize what elements of our behaviors are shaping this current state. What about this current state is really important for us to maintain, and what are the actions that we can take to either maintain that or shift it in a different way moving forward. But with like everything that I say, I'm like, it depends on the context. And so I can't give you like clear like guidelines, but I think that sort of framework for thinking about it is consistent with what I think is how the world actually works and how we should be sort of processing decisions that we make about landscapes. Yeah. 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 A lot of what's necessary in American Samoa is less about, well, it depends on what you're focusing on. The mangroves that remain across the environment are, the degradation is largely trash. So they have like a sewage issue and they have just like a dumping issue where people see these spaces as being like places where other people throw trash. So they're places where I can throw trash. So part of that, I think, is just about like public awareness campaigns around like best practices around dealing with trash, consumption, things of that nature. There are certain areas of the island that also have gone through like active restoration of mangrove areas. And so those have been fully supported by like government subsidies and whatever different kinds of financial incentives that allow for that to happen. I don't have all the details, but those are kind of the two spaces that things have happened where it's just like remediation of trash, because that's kind of like the biggest negative impact. They also have an issue with just like feral pigs and dogs. And so kind of dealing with that as an impact across these systems. And then for some other ones, there are local communities who have worked in partnership with the local agencies to then manage those landscapes collectively. I don't know the inner workings of all of that, but those are the two things that I know are sort of practices that happen on that island. Yeah. I'm gonna skip to a student real fast. I think you're a student. Go for it. Mm. Mhm. It's not a super exciting answer. One thing that tends to happen, especially like early in your research career, is you get defined as the person who does that thing. So like I initially worked in salt marshes, so people were like, Alex is the salt marsh person. And there were just like lots of crab jokes. And I was like, I don't want this life. Um, and so, but I also have been, generally speaking, interested in coastal systems. And so trying to think about what are these systems, where are people not doing as much work, and what are areas that I can sort of fit into that narrative around it. So part of my sort of motivating factor is not necessarily to like move the needle forward and like be innovative in some really unique and special way. It's really to kind of look back at like, what do we already know about these spaces and what are we missing about these things and how can we fill in some of those gaps? And so it seemed to me that there were gaps missing in our understanding about some of these aspects of these systems. And so I became really curious and kind of diving into those. And so I might do mangroves for a while and then like shift into another kind of thing. It really just kind of, it goes with what makes the most sense, I think, at any given time. But so not super exciting, sorry. Yeah, Claire. Oh, I forgot. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So the question, sorry. Yeah. So the question, so I'm apologizing to everyone on Zoom for not repeating all the questions. I was too excited. Um, and so the question that Claire just asked is about like, how do we sort of think about ways to manage trash, especially within systems like these island systems where it's not just enough to think about removing the trash, but really preventing the accumulation of it to begin with. I actually think that it's really interesting, especially here too, because I think they do have like public like sanitation work is like a big aspect of the island, but I don't know how much of that is really like rooted in communities also being aware of the importance of managing those things and then also being really thoughtful about the choices they make with their trash. I also don't know, because I haven't really asked this in sort of any direct specific kind of way, is like how trash is managed when it's on the island. So like, what do they do with it? That's not an answer that I know, and that's something that I would be curious to also find out. But I just know that just from my experience in that space, they have done a lot of work to try to communicate with folks to like not dump in the mangroves, but I don't know that they've also done a really good job of communicating why that's important and also what are some easy alternatives to do instead, right? Because I think that sometimes it's like the labor required to just like dump something in your backyard versus like drive up the mountain to the place where you're allowed to like put the trash might also be a limiting factor for how people engage in this. But I'm just kind of guessing at this point because I'm not 100% sure. Like, should I steal answers from like questions on the Zoom real fast? So I don't want people to feel like they're not here. Is that your job? Okay. Yeah, I'm forgetting the name of it right now. I have some photos of like for the areas on the island where mangrove restoration has happened in collaboration, they have a big sign outside that says like this community has been working with like this agency to do mangrove restoration. I believe that most of that work has been around, again, trash removal and also just like not cutting down trees. So thinking about some of the other alternative things that people can do instead of cut things down in those spaces. I don't know that planting has actually not been massive on the island as like a restoration practice. But the thing that gets tricky, and as you can see from this photo, American Samoa, like flat land is at a premium. So most of the island is just like this massive forested mountain system internally on the interior. And so for people who have like growing families, the little homes they live in are not sufficient. So the mangroves get cut down to be used as part of the building for new homes. And so I think there's lots of conversation around what are the ways that the local communities can better accommodate families growing without also cutting down trees within those spaces to do that. And so those are some of the sort of, I think, larger narratives around recovering health of these systems. Planting has not been a really big one, but that's something that I would be curious about trying to see how they might move in that direction if the goal is to also recover the mangroves that have already been cut down. Yeah. Mm. Yeah, so my process was initially just about how can I talk to as many people as possible who will talk to me. So I wasn't targeting specific organizations. It was really about who can connect me with whoever else is present across the space. And it kind of just ended up being a snowball thing where I like met a few people and they knew a few people and then like, I talked to those people and they knew a few people. And then at one point this guy was like, how about we turn this into like a written survey form? And they have this thing called Coast Week every year in America Samoa where they go out and they do things to like do remediation, do cleanups and things of that nature. And they get lots of students and lots of like older folk in the community. So he just like printed out a ton of my interview questions and they just like passed them out to the whole community. And then they all gave them back to him and then he mailed them to me. So it has just been about talking, like getting as wide a spread of respondents as possible. This initial stage had not been targeted about folks who work in management versus folks who do other XYZ kinds of things. I was mostly just really curious about getting a robust understanding from as many people as possible about how they connect with these spaces. And I don't know what I'm going to do with that information yet. I've got a lot of surveys in a drawer at my office. Yeah. 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 Thank you. Mm. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm sure there are, and I can tell you what mine is. So when I'm thinking about oh, right. sorry, I get so excited. So the question is about how I define the term rewilding, because in various contexts, it can mean different things. For me, it has meant a lot about thinking about what species have been here before that have played really important roles in these environments. Have their populations been depleted for whatever reason? And then are there ways to then recover those populations? So taking something that has been impacted in some negative way and then trying to recover that state for that particular species for whatever purpose, or for restoration purposes is what I'm talking about. But that term does mean different things for different folks. And in various other talks, I have just like used like reintroduction or some other word to mean the same thing, but that's kind of what I mean in this particular context. And so, yeah, sometimes that might mean for the blue crab example, in that environment, it's less about like adding more species or adding more blue crabs, but really just allowing what's there to recover their population sizes. In some cases, it could just be a matter of like that species is no longer here at all, and we might just need to add it back into that space. And so I think that like the Yellowstone wolf example is like one really big one of like adding species back in. But that's kind of that's what I mean when I use it in this particular context. Yeah. Yeah, so when I'm talking about species, I do mean animals instead of plants in these contexts, because the plants are usually a part of the foundational like the part of the foundational restoration practice to begin with. And so it's really thinking about what other things are missing that we could be adding back into this space. Yeah. Yeah. So the question is about if I'm aware of what's happening in Samoa, which is different from American Samoa, and whether or not some of the different histories and practices and processes there are influencing my work. The answer is no. I'm not super informed about what's happening sort of in that sort of larger political social landscape. I know that they have lots of interconnections, but I'm less familiar with what those things look like at this exact moment in time. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Yeah, so the question is really thinking about some of the framing that I have used in the talk unintentionally has sort of named kind of the reality that the folks who live in these islands might be negatively impacting the mangroves, and that there might be also beneficial activities that they're doing within those spaces that help with recovery. And so I guess there's maybe two things I should note here. So for this work in American Samoa, this has largely been about kind of that cultural aspect, and so not necessarily thinking about the species reintroduction aspect of things, because I've just been kind of trying to link that aspect a bit more closely in this work. What I do know from just incidental, anecdotal conversations with people is that some folks will be in situations where they'll like see a mangrove like a sapling or like a propagule like in the space, and it's like not planted, it's just kind of like there for whatever reason. They'll like see it, they'll pick it up, and they'll plant it in the ground, and they're like, I hope that this leads to something moving forward. And so I think there's a lot of like that kind of like anecdotal folks who are aware of these different aspects of the system and aware that like that behavior might lead to something positive moving forward. I don't know if that's something that happens at scale in American Samoa, at least for just generally folks who live in those areas. I do otherwise know that like many of the activities that they have within these spaces, I think the largest harmful ones are really the trash and the cutting things down. And the cutting things down has been limited. I think there's a big effort to push in dealing with the trash aspect of things. And I imagine that those two things put together would actually lead to a lot of recovery. In most cases, you don't have to actively restore an environment. It'll just kind of do its own thing and recover if you give it enough time and if you stop messing with it. And so I imagine that like with those two things that can happen in that space, they actually might see a really, really good, healthy recovery if given enough time. And so yeah, like anecdotally, I don't have a strong sense of the other kinds of behaviors that people have with those spaces, except just like appreciating them, right? And so I don't know that that's enough to like help with the health concerns, but I think that that moves things. At least I think it's a sort of a good foundational step for thinking about what are other ways that we can get people engaged in sort of recovery and restoration practices within these spaces that are also really easy for them to do in their day-to-day. But again, early days, so I can't say for sure. And I think there's a question on the Zoom, maybe one more. We're very fast. Yeah, I'm happy to take it. So one is asking along similar lines where we are for example, yeah, and so when I was talking with people in my interviews, oh, it was a Zoom one, yeah. Yeah, when I was talking to people, I never, or I tried to never use any jargon, because ecosystem service doesn't mean anything to the average person walking around. And so a lot of the questions that you see here are what felt like really accessible questions that would allow people to give as much information as they wanted to about whatever thing they were thinking about in response to that question. And so if my goal is to kind of understand what ecosystem services or cultural ecosystem services that people have associated with these landscapes, it really meant taking a lot of these questions, their responses to them, and then trying to group them into ecosystem service categories as we know them. And so people weren't using language directly from like the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment related to like ecosystem services and functions, but you can kind of get thematic responses that you can start to group into some of those categories, which then allows you to kind of frame some of their responses into that framework, but that's not what I led with. I think that leading with the jargon actually creates a lot of distance between you and the folks that you're talking to. And so for the most part, I was just like chatting with people in their homes and asking general questions and responding to all of their questions and just, you know, being as conversational as possible. Yeah, that's my answer to that question. Thank you. Cool.